High Commander Zhale's office occupied the highest floor of the Academy's central tower, and its windows looked out across the entire continent. Kira arrived at dawn as ordered and found the commander standing before those windows with her hands clasped behind her back. "I have not slept in 3 days," Zhale said without turning around. "Do you know why? Because of what the scanners revealed about my species." "Partially correct." Zhale finally turned, and Kira saw exhaustion etched into her silver features. "I have spent 72 hours reviewing every classified archive the Coalition possesses regarding humanity, and what I found has fundamentally altered my understanding of the galaxy." She gestured to a chair, and Kira said, "The precursors were the most advanced civilization ever recorded." Zhale began. "They mapped the entire galaxy and cataloged over 900,000 sentient species, and they developed threat classifications that we still use today. But you said my classification was different because humans were different." Zhale activated a holographic display, and ancient text scrolled through the air between them. "The precursors sent survey teams to Earth approximately 12,000 years ago, during what your species calls the Stone Age. And the reports they sent back were so alarming that the Precursor Council voted unanimously to quarantine your entire solar system." Kira leaned forward. "What did they find?" "They found a species that defied every biological model they had ever developed." Zhale highlighted sections of the floating text as she spoke. "Humans are pursuit predators, which means you evolved to hunt by simply following prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. And no other known sentient species developed this trait." "We know about persistence hunting," Kira said. "It is basic human history. But do you understand its implications?" Zhale's mercury eyes gleamed with something between admiration and fear. "Most predators sprint and strike. And if they fail, they rest and try again later. But humans do not stop. And your ancestors would track a single animal for days, without pause, until it literally died from the stress of being chased." She expanded the display to show biological diagrams. "Your species can regulate body temperature through sweating, which allows you to remain active in heat that would incapacitate any other being. And you can metabolize fat reserves during extended exertion. And you possess pain tolerance thresholds that our medical experts initially assumed were data errors." Kira absorbed this information with growing understanding. She had always known humans were stubborn, but she had never realized that stubbornness was written into their very biology. "The precursors classified you as endurance predators because you do not defeat opponents through superior strength or speed." Zhale continued. "You defeat them by simply refusing to be defeated until they break first." "And the extinction class rating?" Zhale's expression darkened. "The survey team observed a tribal conflict during their time on Earth, and they watched a group of humans pursue their enemies across 300 kilometers of hostile terrain over 17 days without stopping to rest." She paused to let that sink in. "The enemies eventually surrendered, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could not endure the psychological pressure of being hunted by something that never stopped coming." Kira remembered Milo's story about Corvin Ridge and understood now why the Coalition's warriors had spoken that name with such respect. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because the final examination begins in 1 week," Zhale replied. "And I have decided that Epsilon Squad will participate under standard protocols rather than modified ones." Kira's heart jumped. "You mean we will face the same challenges as the elite squads?" "I mean you will face live combat against captured Void Collective raiders, just as every other squad will face." The Void Collective was a pirate organization that terrorized the Coalition's outer territories. Their raiders were brutal fighters who viewed mercy as weakness and surrender as impossible. Every year, cadets died during the final examination. Previous instructors believed Epsilon Squad required protection from the full examination experience. Zhao said. But I have reviewed the precursor archives, and I have watched your training sessions, and I have reached a different conclusion. She leaned forward across her desk. I believe Epsilon Squad may be the most dangerous unit in this year's class precisely because everyone has underestimated you. Kira felt the weight of that statement settle onto her shoulders. What would you have me do? Train your squad the human way. Zhao replied. Teach them persistence and psychological warfare and the art of making your enemy fear you more than death. She stood and walked back to her windows. I cannot openly favor Epsilon Squad without causing political complications. But I can remove the restrictions that have been holding you back, so use this week wisely. Cadet Yun. Kira rose and saluted in the human fashion. I will not disappoint you. Commander, I know you will not. The week that followed was the most intense of Kira's life. She gathered her squad each morning before dawn and pushed them through exercises that would have seemed impossible. A month ago, Senna learned to use her small size and quick mind to anticipate enemy movements before they happened. Kira taught her that fragility could become unpredictability if wielded correctly. Y'all struggled at first with the aggressive tactics. Kira demonstrated his gentle nature rebelled against the violence that combat demanded. I cannot hurt others, he told her one evening after a particularly difficult session. It goes against everything I believe. Kira sat beside him and placed her small hand against his massive arm. You do not have to hurt others, she said softly. You have to protect your family. And sometimes protection requires standing between those you love and those who would harm them. But what if protecting my family means destroying someone else's? Then you make that choice with full awareness of its weight, Kira replied. And you carry that weight for the rest of your life, because that is what it means to be a warrior. Yol was silent for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. I understand now why my people's warrior trials demanded I kill the sacred beast, he said. They wanted me to prove I could make that choice. And you proved something more important instead, Kira told him. You proved that you would not take a life without reason. And that makes you more dangerous than any mindless killer because you will never hesitate when the reason is clear. Milo began speaking more as the week progressed. He shared tactics from the border, wars and described battles that should have been impossible to survive. The enemy expected us to retreat when our casualties reached 40%. He recalled, and when we advanced instead, they broke and ran, because you did not behave like their models predicted. Senna observed, exactly. Milo's eyes met Kira's and she saw the warrior behind the trauma. Humans do not follow expected patterns because we write our own patterns. And that terrifies beings who rely on predictability. On the final night before the examination, Epsilon Squad gathered in their barracks and looked at each other with something new in their eyes. They were no longer outcasts bound together by rejection. They were a family forged in shared struggle. Tomorrow they expect us to hide and survive, Kira said. Tomorrow they expect Epsilon Squad to prove once again that we do not belong here. She looked at each of them in turn. Tomorrow we show them what we truly are. Senna smiled with a confidence she had never possessed before Yol straightened his massive frame with resolve, replacing his usual uncertainty. Milo simply nodded, because he already knew what humans were capable of. And Kira felt ready for whatever the examination would bring. She had spent her whole life being underestimated. Tomorrow she would make them regret every assumption they had ever made about humanity. Tomorrow the hunt would begin. The alarms continued screaming for 17 minutes before High Commander Zhale arrived. She came with a full security detail, 12 armed guards in combat armor and 3 technicians carrying diagnostic equipment that Kira had never seen before. The corridor had become crowded with onlookers from every species represented at the Academy. They pressed against the security barriers with expressions ranging from confusion to terror. Derek still had not moved from where he had fallen. His squad mates had fled the moment the alarms began, but he remained frozen on the ground with the shattered remnants of his ancestral weapons scattered around him like broken dreams. High Commander Zhale was a Volante like the administrator who had processed Kira on her first day, but there was nothing dismissive about her. She stood nearly 2 meters tall, and her silver skin had darkened to the color of storm clouds. Her mercury eyes swept across the scene with the calculating precision of someone who had commanded armies. Clear this corridor. She ordered her guards moved instantly, and within seconds only Kira, Derek, and the command staff remained. Zhale approached the nearest scanner console and studied its readings with an expression that grew more troubled by the moment. "This is not possible," she murmured. "Commander," one of her technicians called out. "The classification system is accessing archive protocols, and I do not recognize these symbols." "I do," Zhale replied quietly. She turned to look at Kira, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, Kira saw something other than contempt directed at her. She saw uncertainty. "Cadet Yoon, do you understand what you have done?" Kira looked down at her bleeding hand where fragments of Derek's blade still protruded from her flesh. "I defended myself. You destroyed a Torvan ceremonial blade with your bare hands," Zhale said. "Those weapons are forged from neutron-compressed alloys designed to withstand direct plasma bombardment, and you crushed it like paper. He was going to kill me." "That is not the point." Admiral Voss arrived before Zhale could continue. He was older than his son, but twice as imposing, and rage radiated from him like heat from a star. "I demand this creature's immediate expulsion," he bellowed. "She has assaulted my son and destroyed a priceless family heirloom." "Admiral," Zhale interrupted, "look at the scanner readings." "I do not care about scanner readings." "You should." Something in Zhale's tone made Voss pause. He stepped toward the console, and his crimson scales paled to pink as he read what appeared there. "What is this classification?" he demanded. "I have never seen these symbols, because they have not been used in over 8,000 years, Zhale explained. "They date from the Precursor Wars, when the Coalition's founders cataloged every species they encountered across the galaxy." She gestured to the display, where strange symbols pulsed in angry red light. "The classification system is attempting to process Cadet Yoon's biometric data, and it has accessed the deepest archives to find a match." "And what match has it found?" Zhale's mercury eyes met Voss's gaze without flinching. "The precursors called them endurance predators, and they assigned them an extinction class threat rating." Silence fell across the corridor. Even Admiral Voss seemed unable to speak. Kira listened to these revelations with a strange sense of detachment. She had known her whole life that humans were different, but she had never understood exactly how different until this moment. "What does extinction class mean?" Derek asked from the ground. His voice had lost all its former arrogance and trembled like a child. Zhale turned to face him, and her expression held something that might have been pity. "It means that the precursors, who conquered half the galaxy in their time, took one look at humanity's homeworld and decided never to go back." "That makes no sense," Voss sputtered. "Humans are weak and short-lived, and they possess no natural weapons. They possess something far more dangerous than natural weapons." "Admiral," Zhale reached out and took Kira's injured hand in her own. With surprising gentleness, she began removing the blade fragments from Kira's palm. "Humans do not stop," she continued. "They do not accept defeat, and they do not recognize limitations that other species consider absolute." She held up a fragment of the destroyed blade. "Your son's weapon was designed to be unbreakable, and Cadet Yoon's response to being threatened with it was to break it anyway, because she simply refused to accept that she could not." Voss looked at his son, then at Kira, and then at the scanner readings that continued to pulse their ancient warning. "I withdraw my demand for expulsion," he said quietly, "but I want this human watched closely. On that point we agree." Zhale replied. She released Kira's hand and stepped back. "Cadet Yoon, report to the medical bay for treatment, and then report to my office at dawn because we have much to discuss." Kira nodded and turned to leave as she passed. "Derek," she paused and looked down at him. "I did not want to destroy your blade," she said simply. "But you gave me no choice." Derek said nothing. He could not seem to find any words. Kira walked through the parting crowd, with her blood dripping onto the floor behind her. She felt every eye upon her, but she did not care. Something had changed tonight. The galaxy had looked at humanity and seen prey for thousands of years. Now they were beginning to understand their mistake. In the medical bay, a Quillari doctor cleaned and sealed her wounds while asking questions that Kira answered with minimal words. The blade fragments had cut deep, but no permanent damage had been done. Her hand would be sore for a few days, and then it would heal. Humans always healed. That was part of what made them terrifying. Senna, Yo, and Milo were waiting outside when she emerged. Their faces held concern and confusion, and something that might have been wonder. "We heard what happened," Senna whispered. "Is it true that you broke Derek's blade?" "Yes." "How?" Kira flexed her bandaged hand and felt the dull ache of healing flesh. "I squeezed until it stopped being solid." Yul shook his massive head slowly. "I have seen Torvan blades cut through armored vehicles. And you crushed one with your fingers. She is human," Milo said quietly. It was the first time he had initiated conversation in weeks. Everyone looked at him. On Corvin Ridge, he continued, "I watched a sergeant lift a collapsed beam off a wounded soldier, and the beam weighed 3,000 kilograms. And she had 2 broken arms when she did it." His eyes met Kira's and she saw understanding there. Humans are not stronger than other species in any measurable way. But when we need to be strong, when there is no other option, we find strength that should not exist. Senna's delicate features twisted with confusion. "But that violates basic biological principles." Milo almost smiled. "Yes, and humans violate basic biological principles every single day. Because we simply refuse to accept that we cannot." The 4 of them walked back to the barracks together, and Kira felt something warm spread through her chest despite the cold. Night air. This was her family now. These outcasts and misfits who had been told they did not belong. Together they would show the Academy exactly what the unwanted could accomplish. Tomorrow she would meet with High Commander Jael and learn what the ancient archives revealed about her species. Tomorrow the real work would begin. But tonight she would rest with her squad around her and know that she was exactly where she was meant to be. 3 weeks passed and Kira learned what it meant to be hated by an entire world. The Academy's training grounds were designed for species with natural advantages that humans simply did not possess: running courses, assumed legs that could bound 20 meters in a single leap, combat drills expected claws or armored hides, or the ability to see in spectrums beyond visible light. Weapons training provided guns built for hands with 4 fingers and palms, twice the size of her own. None of it stopped her. Every morning began at the sound of a tone that rattled her bones. Every morning she rose before the tone and began running. The track around Epsilon Squad's training compound was designed for bronthery conditioning, and each lap took 30 minutes for most species to complete. Kira completed it in 22 minutes on her first day. By the end of the 3rd week, she had pushed that time down to 19 minutes, and her feet had bled so many times that the medical staff kept bandages ready specifically for her. "You need to stop," Senna told her one evening as Kira limped back from yet another unauthorized training session. "Your body is breaking down faster than it can repair itself." "My body will adapt," Kira replied. "Humans always adapt." "What if you are wrong?" Kira met her friend's worried gaze and smiled through the pain. "Then I will die doing what I chose to do rather than accepting what they chose for me." Senna had no answer for that. The harassment began in the 2nd week when Derek Voss noticed that Epsilon Squad had not yet surrendered to despair. Derek was everything Kira despised about the Coalition's warrior culture. He came from 12 generations of military commanders, and his family name opened doors across the entire galaxy. His scales were a deep crimson that marked him as Torvan nobility, and his ceremonial blade hung at his hip as a constant reminder of his bloodline's glory. He found Kira in the equipment hall one afternoon as she struggled to modify a rifle stock to fit her smaller hands. The human thinks she can shoot, he announced to his squad mates, who gathered behind him like shadows. Kira did not look up from her work. The human knows she can shoot. Derek's clawed hand slammed down on the workbench, hard enough to crack the surface. Look at me when I address you, creature. Kira set down her tools and raised her eyes to meet his. She was barely tall enough to reach his chest, but she did not blink. I see you, she said quietly. Do you feel seen now? His squad mates laughed nervously because no one spoke. To Derek Voss that way, no one had ever dared. The Torvan leaned closer until his breath washed hot across her face. You do not belong here, and everyone knows it. So why you keep pretending? Because pretending is what the weak do, Kira answered. And I am not weak. Derek's hand moved so fast that she barely tracked it. His claws raked across the workbench, inches from her fingers, and left deep gouges in the metal. Next time I will not miss. He turned and walked away with his entourage following in his wake. Kira looked down at the gouges and felt something cold settle into her chest. Not fear, something else, something patient. The weeks continued. And Epsilon's squad began to change. Senna discovered that her fragile body could move through spaces that larger beings could not access. She learned to use her size as camouflage and her brilliant mind to predict enemy movements before they happened. Y'all struggled with the violence that training demanded, but Kira helped him understand something important. Strength did not require. Cruelty and mercy could be a weapon when wielded correctly. Milo-chan remained silent through most of their sessions, but he began sitting closer to the group. One evening he spoke for the first time since Kira had arrived. I was at the Battle of Corvin Ridge, he said, without preamble. Everyone stopped what they were doing. Corvin Ridge was a name that even the Coalition's proudest warriors spoke with respect. It was where 3,000 human soldiers had held a mountain pass against 50,000 enemy troops for 11 days until reinforcements arrived. I was a medic. Milo continued, his voice flat and distant. On the fourth day, a shell collapsed our forward bunker and broke my spine. Senna's breath caught. You survived a spinal injury in combat? I did more than survive, Milo said. I carried 3 wounded soldiers 18 kilometers through enemy territory to the secondary aid station because there was no one else left to do it. Yul stared at him with something approaching awe. How is that possible? Milo finally looked up and his eyes held depths that none of them could fully comprehend because they needed me to do it. So I did it. He said nothing more that night, but he sat with them until lights out, and that was enough. The confrontation Kira had been expecting came on the last day of the 3rd week. She was walking back to the barracks after evening meal when Derek and 6 of his squad mates appeared from the shadows between buildings. I have been watching you, Derek said as he drew his ceremonial blade. The weapon gleamed in the artificial light, and Kira knew its history. It had been forged 3,000 years ago from metals harvested from a dying star. It could cut through starship armor. It had killed more beings than she could count. You should not have been watching, she replied calmly. You might have learned something. Derek's scales flushed darker with rage. Kneel before me, human, and acknowledge the superiority of true warrior blood. Academy security drones floated at the corridor's entrance, but they did not move to intervene. Of course they would not. Derek's family funded half the Academy's research programs. Kira looked at the blade that was aimed at her face. She looked at Derek's eyes burning with centuries of inherited arrogance. She looked at the security drones waiting for her to submit like everyone expected, and something inside her shifted. Cold became colder, patient became ready. "No," she said. Derek swung the blade toward her throat with the speed that had made Torvans the terror of 100 worlds. Kira's hand came up. Her fingers wrapped around the ancient steel, and she squeezed. The sound was like nothing anyone present had ever heard. A shriek of protesting metal followed by a crack that seemed to echo far longer than physics should have allowed. Derek's legendary blade shattered in her grip. Fragments of sacred steel scattered across the ground, and Derek stumbled backward with something new in his eyes. Fear, real fear. But that was not the worst part. Every scanner in the corridor came alive at once. Alarms cascaded through the Academy's network, and red lights began flashing in patterns that had not been used in living memory. Kira stood in the center of it all, with her hand still raised and fragments of a 3,000-year-old weapon embedded in her palm. She did not feel the pain. She only felt certain that everything was about to change. The shuttle descended through clouds of pale violet gas, and Kira Yoon pressed her face against the viewport, like a child seeing snow for the first time below her stretched Nexus Prime. A world that existed for one purpose alone: to train the deadliest warriors the Galactic Coalition had ever produced. The Academy covered an entire continent. Its structures carved from black stone that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. Kira had seen images during her journey, but nothing prepared her for the scale of it all. She was 23 years old, and she was about to become the first human ever admitted to these grounds. The shuttle touched down with barely a tremor, and the other passengers rose from their seats with practiced ease. Most of them were Torvans, massive creatures covered in natural armor plating who stood nearly 3 meters tall. A few Krellans moved among them, their forearms folded in poses of casual superiority. None of them looked at Kira. She preferred it that way. The boarding ramp lowered and heat washed over her face, carrying scents of metal and something that reminded her of burnt cinnamon. She grabbed her single bag and walked into her new life. The main processing hall was a cathedral of efficiency, where dozens of species formed orderly lines before scanning stations. Each station contained a pillar of blue light that read everything about whoever stepped inside. Its species classification, threat assessment, combat potential, genetic markers, and 100 other measurements that would determine a cadet's entire future at the Academy. Kira joined the shortest line and waited. The Volante administrator at her station was a slender being with silver skin and eyes like pools of mercury. She processed cadets with mechanical precision, barely glancing at the readouts before waving them through. When Kira stepped into the scanner, the blue light flickered. Then it flickered again. The Volante frowned and tapped her console. "Step out and step back in," she ordered. Kira obeyed. The scanner hummed louder this time, and the light turned from blue to amber before settling into an ugly shade of gray. Inconclusive, the Volante muttered. She tapped more controls, and the gray light pulsed without resolving into anything useful. "What does that mean?" Kira asked. "It means our equipment was not designed for your species," the administrator replied with barely concealed irritation. "You are the human, yes?" the one admitted under the new treaty provisions. "I am." "Then proceed to Orientation Hall 7, Cadet Yoon, and try not to break anything else today." Kira wanted to point out that she had not broken anything at all, but she recognized dismissal when she heard it. She walked deeper into the Academy and felt the weight of countless stairs pressing against her back. Orientation Hall 7 was nearly empty when she arrived. A handful of cadets sat scattered across seats designed for beings much larger than humans, and none of them looked particularly happy to be there. Kira chose a seat near the middle and studied her new classmates. There was a quillary female in the front row whose delicate frame seemed ready to shatter at a harsh word. Her species was known for their brilliant minds and their bodies that broke like glass. Behind her sat a Brontery male, easily the largest being in the room. but his posture spoke of defeat rather than strength. His kind were supposed to be fearless warriors, but this one kept his eyes fixed on the floor. And in the far corner sat another human. Kira felt her breath catch. She had not known there would be others of her kind here. The young man was perhaps a year or two older than her, with dark hair cut military short and eyes that seemed to look through the walls rather than at them. He did not acknowledge her presence before she could approach him. The doors slid open and their squad leader entered. Tovin Hesh was a Krullen, four-armed and covered in scales that shifted between green and black depending on his mood. Right now they were very dark indeed. "Welcome to Epsilon Squad," he announced without enthusiasm. "I am Senior Instructor. Hesh and I have been assigned to oversee your training for the duration of your time at this academy." He paused to let his gaze sweep across them all. "Let me be clear about something from the start. None of you should be here." Kira felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. "The Quillari are too fragile for combat operations," Hesh continued, pointing at the female in the front row. "The Bronthri are too slow and too gentle despite their size. And humans are." He stopped and made a sound that might have been laughter. "Humans are a diplomatic obligation, nothing more. And I will not pretend otherwise." "What about him?" the Bronthri asked quietly. Gesturing toward the other human, Hesh's scales flickered. "Cadet Chun is a special case, and you will not ask about him again." The Bronthri nodded and returned his attention to the floor. Kira filed that information away for later. The orientation continued with Hesh explaining the academy structure, its rules, and its expectations. Epsilon Squad would train separately from the elite units and would be evaluated on a modified scale that accounted for their various deficiencies. In other words, Kira realized they would be kept out of sight and out of mind until graduation or death, whichever came first. After Hesh dismissed them, Kira made her way to the Quillari female. "I am Kira," she said simply. The Quillari looked up with surprise in her large, dark eyes. "Senna," she replied. "You are the first person to speak to me since I arrived 3 days ago. Then everyone else is foolish." Kira said, "I saw your entrance scores on the shuttle manifest, and your tactical analysis rating is higher than anyone else in our year." Senna's face flushed a deeper shade of blue. "My body cannot keep up with my mind. Then we will figure out how to make your mind enough." The Bronthri approached them with hesitant steps that shook the floor despite his obvious effort to move quietly. "I am Yo," he said. "I heard what you told Senna, and I wonder if perhaps you might have similar advice for me." Kira studied his massive form, the gentle slope of his shoulders, and the kindness that seemed to radiate from him despite everything. "Why are you here?" "Yal?" "Because I failed my warrior trials on Bronter," he admitted. "I could not bring myself to kill the sacred beast they placed before me, so my family sent me here in disgrace rather than face the shame of my weakness." "That was not weakness," Kira said firmly. "That was choice, and choice is the most powerful weapon any warrior can carry." Yo blinked at her with something that looked almost like hope behind them. The other human rose from his seat and walked toward the exit without a word. "Cadet Chun," Kira called out. He paused but did not turn around. "Whatever happened to you? You are not alone here anymore." For a long moment he stood frozen in the doorway. Then he nodded once and disappeared into the corridor beyond. Senna touched Kira's arm with fingers that felt like bird bones wrapped in silk. "How do you know what to say to everyone?" Kira smiled, but there was something hard beneath it. "Because I have been the one that nobody wanted before. And I learned that the unwanted must become their own family." That night, Kira lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling of her tiny quarters. Tomorrow the real training would begin. Tomorrow she would discover exactly how much the galaxy wanted her to fail. And tomorrow she would begin showing them all exactly what humanity could do when the universe told them no. She closed her eyes and let herself drift towards sleep with one thought echoing through her mind. They had no idea what they had invited through their gates. None of them did.